Hello and welcome to Original Soundchat, where video game music is a work of art. On each episode, it's our goal to help you learn about two soundtracks from the world of games, as well as the people, stories, and critical tracks behind them. My name is DeVader.
And I'm Peter Spezia. We're brought to you by Anonymous Dinosaur and Rhymes with Asia. It's time to appreciate great OSTs and the games that they come from, without getting too bogged down in music theory. Up first this week for our two games is 2010's Ghost Trick Phantom Detective, a puzzle adventure game with Rube Goldberg machines from the creator of Ace Attorney, where going 4 minutes into the past can save a target from murder.
Following that is an obstacle course full of bright colors and set to catchy music, 2010's Bit.Trip Runner.
Well, I sure am glad that both of these games were first released in 2010, because I don't know of any other theme between them.
Otherwise, yeah, there's nothing.
I mean, can you think of anything? That's a tough ask.
Man, it can't even be running because the main character of your game doesn't have legs.
That's true. Oh no. Well, these are great games this week, and soundtracks that often get overlooked, but like secretly great, I think, at least. Anyway, Joe, how are you doing? What are you playing?
I have finished Heaven's Vault. I'm looking forward to talking about that sometime in the near future on this show. It is a very, very neat game. For anybody that has played it, I did not vault. If you've played it, you know what that means. If not, don't worry about it. And I also started a run of Pokemon Crystal, because I need a team to take into Pokemon Stadium 2, which is the next Masterpieces game. And I don't have one. Well, now I have one. Currently, I am rocking a Kadabra, Typhlosion, a Pidgeot, Dragonair, Gramble, and Quagsire. There we go. I was legally obligated to have a Quagsire on my team because Whooper.
Of course, as is tradition, as you got to do. And also good to have Kadabra there. That's a classic for sure for Crystal.
Looking to make that an Alakazam before I bring it into Stadium, but it's going pretty well. Last night I stopped right outside of the Elite Four and just started grinding. I'm planning to try and get a Dragonite before I head in there, so it's going well.
It's a good idea. Crystal's always a classic. Love that one for sure. Oh, I don't think I've played any games this week. Oh, I played more Hades. Just did a couple more runs, beat it a couple more times. My fiance rolled credits on Hades. That's pretty awesome. I'm really proud of her.
Isn't it insane how easy that game is to go back to even after you've rolled credits?
Yeah.
Like, there's still story.
Yeah, and then it feels good to play. I don't know. I keep liking it more and more, but yeah, I gotta eventually get to Persona 5 Strikers. That'd be a good one to get to eventually, but life is busy, work is crazy, and then being old, like I've got a caught shoulder blade, it feels like, and it's affecting my breathing, and it's like, you know what? 33 is just internet old. That's just honestly what it is. In the meantime, let's talk about some composer follow-up news. We've talked about many composers on this show, and you know what? They still keep making great work, doing great things in the game industry, and especially when we talk about game industry headlines, sometimes they or their games are involved in that. Let's talk about Final Fantasy VII Remake. It was a big week for Final Fantasy VII Remake news, where a State of Play PlayStation event happened, where at the end of it, Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade was announced, being a PlayStation 5 version of the game that will be free to upgrade for those who own the game on PlayStation 4. And then for paid DLC content, they're adding episode Yuffie. So Yuffie will come to the game in a special storyline, and also a totally new character. Joe, what's that about?
I have no idea who that is, and I have the distinct feeling that they will be dead before the end of that episode.
Not a bad thought. Yeah, interesting. But then also, Final Fantasy VII Remake will be available for free for its PlayStation 4 version on PlayStation Plus throughout March. So if you haven't played it yet, go ahead, give it a shot on PS4. You can't upgrade that version for free to PS5 though, because Square Enix, money, but it gives you an opportunity to play the game if you haven't yet.
But let's forget all that. We don't need no more. Who cares about the game? Let's talk about how the soundtrack is finally on streaming services.
Yes!
I have been listening to it all day on Spotify. Unfortunately, the titles are in Japanese, so I gotta dig through it to find the ones we pointed out during the Best of 2020 episode. But other than that, man, that soundtrack's still so good.
It's a good time to be alive, and great things, for one of, if not the best soundtrack of 2020.
Very much so. Meanwhile, Pokemon Presents happened actually this morning as of the time of recording. They announced Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, the Gen 4 remakes that people have been clamoring for years. Of course, a lot of people don't like the art direction, but they're nuts.
They're wrong.
They're wrong, and also they weren't going to be happy no matter what they showed. But also, more importantly, they showed off Legends Arceus, which is a Pokemon game that takes place in feudal era Sinnoh. And it looks super cool. My only bummer moment was that I think that Johto probably would have fit a little bit better with this setting, but the game looks interesting. It does look like it still needs a little bit of work. The frame rate was dying in the trailer. Mm-hmm. And they also don't call the Pokeballs apricorns, which seems like a missed opportunity there, but whatever, it's fine. The game looks pretty cool, but also not announced in the Pokemon Presents, but on Twitter. Marnie from Pokemon Sword and Shield recently came to the mobile game Pokemon Masters, where she is voiced by Christina V.
Yeah, so a lot of things there. We've covered Christina V on the show before. We've also talked about Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, so good to see those Gen 4 remakes. I agree. For people who say that they don't like the little chibi art style in this Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl game, but they loved the look of Link's Awakening on Switch, how do you have that thought? Sinnoh is one thing, but you're going back to Arceus, the god of Pokemon, so if you're going to go back to a feudal time and ancient time, start there. That's really interesting. An open world take on Pokemon. A lot of people do fairly, I think, make comparisons to Breath of the Wild. There were some trailer shots. There were some open world. It kind of looked like maybe Monolith is helping a little bit with that open world design, right? But I'm really just impressed that this was a thought that the Pokemon Company was probably not going to do for a variety of reasons. Why would they cater to the hardcore instead of continually, making the most of that child audience for future Pokemon generations to come? And this is kind of an admission that they want to at least try it, especially with a Legends subtitle. I'm excited for sure. But yeah, a long time away, and a game could be pushed back further than early 22, especially in these COVID times.
Oh yeah, and apparently battles are ATB in it.
Interesting.
So I'm hearing, which is kind of nuts, and also you can just on the overworld throw a Pokeball, aim a Pokeball, and then throw it, and then catch something. That is
blows my mind. Literally
something we've never been able to do in a mainstream Pokemon game. It's always just been a button during battle. So nuts.
Exciting how after 25 years they're still finding new ways to innovate. And oh my gosh, that 25-year montage at the beginning was just so many good memories. Just great stuff.
It was very cool. I sure wish it was less than 10 minutes long, but it was very cool.
Finally, Skullgirls is not a dead game, despite all of its controversy in recent months. Anyway, the game is getting a new 4-character Season Pass DLC pack, the first character of which is Annie. So hopefully that means more music for Skullgirls. Vincent Diamante may be working on that. I don't know. But yeah, we've talked about Skullgirls on the show before, and that game is not dead.
Yeah, so for anybody that doesn't know, last year, Skullgirls got in a huge hubbub because Lab Zero, or more specifically, Mike Z, who was one of the directors of Skullgirls. A lot of allegations came out that he was a nightmare to work with and a very problematic individual. And so the publisher who still holds the rights to Skullgirls Autumn Games pulled his involvement away completely. He responded by going nuclear, shutting down the whole studio. And the development of Skullgirls itself was handed to the people that currently handle the mobile game. So that's where this is coming from. So it's been completely disconnected from the bad actor that played a part in its development, and that's great, and may that man never work in video games ever again. And Annie looks cool.
Pretty much, yeah. I'm surprised it's taken this turn, but good for them. Let's get to talking about our first game this week, though, in these 2010 titles. This is Ghost Trick Phantom Detective, a game I have wanted to bring to the show for a very long time, but we've now talked about 3 games that Masakazu Sugimori has composed, the first of which being the original Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney. Then we talked about last year's indie game Murder by Numbers, and now Ghost Trick Phantom Detective. And now that we have an idea of like what to do when a composer does like all of the tracks and how can we bring someone else into the conversation, well, now we have a good idea, because Ghost Trick Phantom Detective is one of those like in the running for best DS game soundtrack.
I'd agree with that. It was also suggested by a couple people.
Yeah. So I definitely appreciate those recommendations, and believe us, a game that we needed to talk about on this show, but just needed the right time. But thank you for those recommendations. Certainly love to get to those this year for sure. So Ghost Trick Phantom Detective, released for Nintendo DS on June 19th, 2010 in Japan as Ghost Trick. The subtitle of Phantom Detective would be added for the Western release in North America on January 11th, 2011, Europe on January 14th, and Australia on January 20th, 2011. Let's note that this is a couple months before the release of the Nintendo 3DS. So this is like literal end of DS life here as an exclusive Nintendo handheld system. An HD version, however, would be published on iOS in Japan on December 16th, 2010, before the West even got the DS game, and then the rest of the world got this iOS port on February 2nd, 2012. Unlike some other iOS ports of Nintendo DS games where something is lost along the way, whether it's the gameplay or the controls of The World Ends With You, or one of the big narrative storytelling devices of 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors, this is actually a good iOS port. So if you're looking to play the game today and you don't want to hunt down a DS cartridge, that iOS version is actually really good, and it's how I played the game. Ghost Trick Phantom Detective is developed and published by Capcom. It is an adventure and puzzle game from Shu Takumi, who he is the creator of the Ace Attorney franchise. So Ghost Trick was his follow-up after the original trilogy of Ace Attorney games. And in Ghost Trick, players control a ghost that must use his powers to prevent murders by moving parts of what is essentially an elaborate Rube Goldberg machine. One of those sort of setups where once you start it, the parts start moving and it kind of triggers the next point and the next point and the next point until the end result happens. During gameplay segments, players can swap at will between the land of the living, where time flows naturally with 4 minutes usually remaining until the murder, and the ghost world, in which time is stopped. Now, in the ghost world, the main character can travel between objects within a certain radius. Now, these objects are represented by blue cores, and in the land of the living, the character can animate these objects to perform actions, which are known as ghost tricks, which open new paths or influences the characters around the environment. So, for example, if you moved over to a tray of donuts and you performed a ghost trick on this tray of donuts, it may prompt a character to change where they're currently seated, and that would give the main character access to new areas because that character has moved away from the tray of donuts. So it allows you to move about the environment and try new things, and it's a lot of trial and error. But outside of these solving murder through Rube Goldberg machines sort of gameplay segments, it's really just a lot of visual novel reading, as you would expect from the creator of Ace Attorney. So, the story of Ghost Trick Phantom Detective. You are Sissel, a spirit who comes to consciousness with no memories of his past. While trying to put things together, Sissel sees the corpse of a man on the ground in a junkyard, and so he believes that, he just died. Another spirit named Ray tells Sissel about the nature of spirits and his special abilities known as ghost tricks. Ray also tells Sissel that he can use ghost tricks to go back 4 minutes before the death of a person and attempt to save their life. Sissel does so to save the life of Lynn, a young detective, from an assassin, as both arrive on the scene for a fateful encounter. After saving Lynn, Sissel learns that she had come to the junkyard to get information from him. Now, since Lynn is the only lead to his past, Sissel decides to follow her. Ray warns, however, that Sissel's spirit will dissipate at dawn. What is the truth about Sissel's past? Can Sissel save a family that has been torn apart by a tragic accident? What are the results of altering time through ghost tricks? And who can help Sissel before dawn breaks? Joe, here's where I'll ask you, what are our experiences with Ghost Trick Phantom Detective?
I don't remember when I played this game. I know I did play it. I played it on DS, I'm pretty sure. But I actually literally cannot, name a time period in which I played it. That's bizarre, and I don't think I've ever run into that before. But yeah, I've played Ghost Trick. It's very good. Listening to the soundtrack in preparation for this show made a lot of stuff kind of come flooding back. And it is absolutely fantastic. I do remember once I finished it, I think I tweeted something along the lines of they should let Shu Takumi work on more things.
Yeah.
More original games. He should absolutely be given that chance. So it's very, very good.
And then he went and did the great Ace Attorney, and maybe one day we'll see those games on Switch in North America. Fingers crossed. I played, as I said, the iOS version. I played it on iPad. It looks real nice with those HD visuals. I'm sure it looks great on DS. One of the big shining examples in that game is just how good the animation quality is.
Oh, yeah.
For, DS kind of pixel art as it is, just some really smooth animations, just really clever stuff there.
Includes one character who I would say is the most immaculately animated character on the DS in any way, shape, or form.
He dances, he moves, he's a joy to look at. It's fantastic. So I played it on an iPad. I think I played most of it on an airplane, which was a pretty cool game to play. It's about 8 to 10 hours long. That's not terribly long, but it's a great story. And it's one of those ones, I think the story gets a little too complex for its own good, but it has some killer reveals at the end. When we talk about big video game plot twists at the end, you can talk about BioShock, you can talk about Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. The late game reveals of Ghost Trick Phantom Detective are all-timers. They're fantastic. So I think I'd forgotten a lot of the details of the story, a lot of the spy plots and the secret society. So I didn't remember much of that. There's a lot involved also with the family of Jowd and Camilla and all that, and I didn't remember much of that too. But it's really the gameplay, the characters, and those big endgame moments. So good.
I don't remember a lot of the reveals. I remember the reveal of who Sissel is.
Yes.
That's the main one that I remember. I meant to like go watch a long play or something before this, but I didn't actually get a chance to do so. But that reveal I remember being pretty like, okay, so that's what's happening. All right.
It's who Sissel is and who Ray is.
Yeah.
That's like, oh, chef's kiss. It's so good. I unfortunately couldn't find too much on the development history of Ghost Trick Phantom Detective, and it's not too surprising when you think about just, I guess, Shu Takumi games in general, because when we were talking about Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, like, there's not too much there either, but I did find a couple things here and there. So Shu Takumi thought of the idea for Ghost Trick while working on the third Ace Attorney game, that would be Trials and Tribulations, and he wanted to make a new type of mystery. Okay, so you think Trials and Tribulations originally came out in 2004? A lot of the songs on that soundtrack are dated 2004. And this game came out in 2010? Like, he had this idea stewing and working for a long time. In fact, the original name for the game was Ghost Spy, which makes sense when you get to like the deeper narrative workings, but the core gameplay being the Ghost Trick, that makes sense. The game overall reviewed well, with a Metacritic score of 83 on DS and 87 on iOS. Like, yeah, it's a good iOS port. It actually improved Metacritic score. Go figure.
Yeah, you don't often see that. Usually it's either exactly the same or just a little bit lower.
Right, exactly. So a good one to check out if you're curious about this game. The story, the animation quality, and the soundtrack were points of praise. Some people were put off by the seemingly trial and error nature of the puzzle solving. Overall, it's a really niche game. It's a game that a lot of people forget exists on the DS library, and it was estimated at about 380,000 copies sold worldwide. Not great. Capcom even listed the game as a contributor to the low sales of its first quarter of its 2010 fiscal year. Like, to be singled out like that, not great. It also launched in a tough spot, especially in the North American market, where, as I said, it was 2 months away from the launch of 3DS. And when it comes to the Video Game Awards season, this was already in a very strong year of 2011. I mean, a lot of great games came out in 2011. So Ghost Trick was nominated for Handheld Game of the Year at the Spike Video Game Awards, as well as at the DICE Awards. In both of those awards shows, it lost to Super Mario 3D Land, because, oh yeah, that came out on 3DS at the end of 2011. It was also nominated for Best Animated Video Game at the Annie Awards, which are generally for animation in general. It won Best Handheld Game from GameSpot and Best DS Game from Game Trailers, while Game Trailers also nominated it for Best Story. In that category, it lost to The Witcher 2 Assassins of Kings, and I would have thought it would have either been Portal 2, Batman Arkham City. 2011 was a real strong year for games.
I didn't know Witcher 2 came out in 2011. That game feels older than that.
It does. Yeah, the first Witcher was 2007?
I think.
Not a very old franchise.
God, that's weird. That's weird to think about.
There has been, nothing about Ghost Trick since the game came out, as far as its legacy goes. I mean, there was one thing where, in an interview with Official Nintendo magazine in 2013, Shu Takumi said that he'd love to make a crossover video game between Ghost Trick and Ace Attorney, speculating that Phoenix Wright could be killed while his killer could be prosecuted by Sissel. Well, that wasn't the crossover that Phoenix Wright got. Obviously, that would be with Professor Layton, and the rest, as they say, is history. But I mean, look, if they do another Marvel vs. Capcom and they somehow want to pull deep and go with Sissel as a character, that'd be a real deep cut, and I would not be angry about it.
And speaking of Marvel vs. Capcom, I believe one of Phoenix Wright's alternate colors is based on Sissel. He gets the red suit.
Oh, you're
and
right.
Blonde hair. So that was a neat throwback. This game feels like a game that should already be on Switch.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Like, how is it not? I mean, I guess Capcom's probably not in a hurry to go put it on anything else, but like, this game would work really well on Switch, I feel like.
It has an HD version. I don't know how you transition iOS back to Switch or whatever, but I mean, yeah, that'd be fantastic. But it's definitely up there as like among the best games that nobody's ever played. Honestly, it's just easy to forget about Ghost Trick. And so when we're talking about the soundtrack, and Masakazu Sugimori is the composer of all the tracks, and we've already covered him before on the show on our Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney episode. Okay, there isn't like a vocalist like there was in Murder by Numbers that we can highlight. What do we do? We go to the sound designer, and she is Azusa Kato. Azusa Kato was born on May 10th in Yokohama in Kanagawa Prefecture in Japan. She is blood type A. Gotta love when Japanese composers, artists somehow just willingly give that information out there like it matters.
I believe in Japan it's like considered like your zodiac sign or your horoscope. Your blood type can decide what your personality's like, essentially, is a bit of folklore in Japan.
Interesting. So like when they're profiled and different websites pull that, like it's just one of those things out there, I guess. That's really interesting to know. So before joining Capcom, Azusa Kato supposedly worked on the 2008 Virtual Life title PlayStation Home with senior composer Toshihiko Horiyama, though her role on that game is unspecified. After that, though, she's worked in Capcom's sound department since 2009. Based on some of her discography, we know that she also plays the keyboard and she sings, but according to the Capcom fandom page about her, quote, little else is known about her. And yeah, you're right, doing Google searches and things like that. I think there was an Azusa Kato who was like a researcher doing work on dementia, something like that. I got a hit for that, but not for the composer.
I don't remember what game it would have been for, but this is the second Capcom composer with that exact line on their fandom page.
It must be just a common cop-out when you don't have much to fill out the article. Yes, because Azusa Kato is a composer. Just her first project at Capcom was working as a sound designer on Ghost Trick Phantom Detective. Since then, she composed for Resident Evil 6, Line Drop Spirit Catcher Lele, which is a Japanese mobile game about the Darkstalkers character Shenko. Just really interesting to see that that's a thing that exists, and she was like the only composer for it. She also composed for Sengoku Basara 4, Dragon's Dogma Online, Monster Hunter Explorer, which is also a mobile game, Umbrella Corps, and most recently, she got like second billing on the Resident Evil 3 remake from 2020.
Which is a good soundtrack. It was one of our honorable mentions last year.
It's Kota Suzuki, Azusa Kato. So yeah, she's still there composing at Capcom. She also arranged the Torchman track on Mega Man 11, and as a performer, she appears on the We Are Rockmen album, playing keyboard, and also the special arranged album for the 3DS release of Gyakuten Saiban 4, or we know that game in the States as Apollo Justice Ace Attorney, and she performed choir vocals on that album, that special arranged album. As far as historical development research for the Ghost Trick Phantom Detective soundtrack, it is definitely the work of Masakazu Sugimori for the main compositions, and he was not only inspired by photos that Shu Takumi gave him to, kind of come up with the game's main theme, but he also took inspiration from artwork that he had around his house for other tracks. In particular, there was, quote, a small oil painting beside me. It was drawn in blue and black, a picture showing the night air, which inspired me a lot. I don't know the name of the artist, though, as I bought it from a street painter in front of the Osaka City Museum of Fine Arts a long time ago. He mentioned how part of the challenge for this soundtrack was getting the bass sounds on a DS just right. And not only for players without headphones who were hearing the game through the speakers, but also for those that put on headphones, because if you tried to balance it for no headphones, just through the speakers, those players who would wear headphones would like get too much bass and it'd be too overmodulated. So you had to find that right balance. And it is a game that certainly rocks that bass, heavy drum kicks. It's really, really good. Overall, the soundtrack was released as a 2 CD set with 37 total tracks on June 24th, 2010 in Japan. So what does one of the best soundtracks on Nintendo DS sound like? Let's get to the critical 5 tracks for Ghost Trick Phantom Detective. And we have to start with that main theme, Ghost Trick. If there is one theme that is immediately identifiable to this game, it is Ghost Trick. Fitting. That's the name of the game in Japan, so for the main theme, fitting to title it like this. I think it's important to note how with Masakazu Sugimori scores that we've covered for his soundtracks, it's all too easy to compare tracks to his Ace Attorney work. So it's like, oh, this song is almost like this song from Ace Attorney that plays this role in the game. And when he works on similar kinds of games that we covered, it's all too easy to make parallels. So not only is Ghost Trick the main theme here, the main leitmotif, it's also kind of the equivalent of the Pursuit theme in a way, where like it's like Sissel's big heroic theme as he's uncovering new truths and revealing big twists. And for the main theme of the game to come back in, it's like, oh yeah, things are really going down now. It's a song you're going to hear a lot. And I'm not going to say it's the best track on the soundtrack, but it's certainly most identifiable as the main theme.
I believe the song also plays like at the end of chapters, which, like you said, when it's revealing a new truth that you've uncovered, it's basically sort of like a transition piece almost.
Yeah, he has the transition jingle in there, of course, would you like to save the game on to the next chapter thing, but yeah, it's a good like wrap up of what happened in this chapter for sure.
And it's the one that when I went back to listen to the soundtrack for the first time in years, this is the one that was like, oh right, this, when that keyboard part comes in, man, oh my god, it's so good.
Yeah, because you're really used to like it's the bass with the drum and like the guitar kind of just driving, and then da 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 da, like it's just this perfect little counter melody, and it just really hits you in a good way.
Yeah, fantastic. It is not my favorite song on the soundtrack, but it is a very, very close second.
It's definitely a good one. Let's get to number 2 on the Critical 5, though. I really like this one. This is Fate Updated. Time is passing. So what do you need to trick next? So this takes place in these main gameplay segments where you're kind of exploring, what can you move? What can you trick to move on to the next part of solving this big Rube Goldberg machine, essentially. And this piece really just hits you because in the 4 minutes that you have in real time, which of course you can stop and be in the world of the dead and kind of move around and figure out what to do next with all the time that you can take. But for like the first 3 minutes, it's this. And then when 1 minute remains, it's a more frenetic piece. And then it's when you're down to the seconds. Oh, that's chaos. But I love this one in particular. And it just gives me this vibe of almost like breaking news at 6 o'clock. Like, it's got that kind of imminent feeling of, hey, pay attention. Like, something needs to happen. You need all your attention focused on this game at this moment. And I feel like you almost get like the clock ticking in the background just to remind you of the time. Oh, love the feel of this piece and the vibe that the drums kick in with. Fantastic.
Yeah, this is my favorite song on the soundtrack, personally. It just has this really, really good tension to it, which I mean is fitting. You're on a timer. you are wasting time if you stop to listen to this song for too long. But it's just really, really catchy, despite the fact that it's basically just the same repeating melody over and over again. But it just fits the kind of gameplay that Ghost Trick has. It's sort of the feeling you're supposed to have while trying to stop these murders or deaths from occurring. It's really good. Absolutely.
You're going to get used to hearing this piece for sure. Love the piano chords that come in, the synths that kind of fade in and then fade out. So good. It may have even been a track that I used in a podcast or two in my years. It's just that perfect newsworthiness track. Honest to God, it's love it. Love it. Number 3 on the Critical 5. Let's get to it. Pick up the intensity here. This is A Dashing Enigma. So as we continue to make comparisons between what this track is and what Ace Attorney is like, I mean, the last track, Fate Updated, that's almost like, the cross-examination Moderato in a way. Whereas this one, A Dashing Enigma, man, you can just feel it right from the beginning, right from the start of the clip. Like, we're in an intense mood here, and then the like that building undercurrent, it's just really pushing you forward. And I feel like this is the equivalent of when you find critical evidence in an investigation. When you're going through more of like the visual novel stuff, and you're not doing too much of like the intense puzzle-like gameplay, but the truth is coming to light here. And this piece playing shows you that you're onto some good stuff.
And it also just, that sliding, it's a synth, obviously, but it sounds almost like a woodwind in the background. Like the ooh, like that kind of thing. I don't know, for some reason, I'm really like drawn to that part specifically. But yeah, this is one of the ones that I didn't remember, and I don't fully remember hearing. Whereas the last two were like, oh yeah, no, I've heard this song. So I don't know. It's very good, though. I definitely think it fits your description there of comparing it to, like, almost the suspense theme in Ace Attorney, the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. A lot more complex than that song, because literally any song in the world can be more complex than that song, but it still has that same sort of feel.
I think it just goes to show that how Masakazu Sugimori, who, yeah, that Ace Attorney suspense piece, despite it being the simplest thing in the world, it's also one of the greatest things in the world because like it's so effective in its simplicity. And then with the multiple layers of what the DS sound chip allows for, I mean, to be able to have all of these layers and still be so effective. Yeah, I love his work. It's simple, it's driven by melody, and it's highly effective. And my favorite piece from him on this soundtrack comes in at number 4 on the Critical 5. This is Trauma. We're talking about some late game revelations in this one. Not like the end with Sissel and Ray, but like when we're talking about like backstories of antagonists and like kind of how heart-wrenching their experiences have been, making you kind of sympathetic to them, and they're telling you of like the pain that they've gone through, and this piece is playing. This track stands out in particular. I think you probably heard it at the end of the clip there, where this little saw comes in, this synth saw that like sounds grating, and you're probably like, oh, what is that? Trust me when I say, like, if you don't like it just hearing it on its own, like, it's so effective in the game. I personally love it. I think all the different layers and the from the A to B to C, like the places that this piece goes and then back to the loop, it's so cool. The saw in particular, wow, it just like stands out and really highlights the trauma essentially for it to be titled that. Super fitting. And I just love the places that this one goes. My favorite piece on the soundtrack.
Yeah, it also has this really effective sort of tinge of sadness just in the back. For like late game twists, that's really fitting. It's a very good piece. I think it's probably third on my list of favorites here.
And I think Ghost Trick does a really good job with like the kind of somber, sad pieces.
I mean, when you're a game dealing with death, like
yeah,
that's very fitting.
Yeah, this one just has a good energy to it that, wow, I could gush and gush for minutes on end about this one. This is a great one for sure. This is one I thought of immediately. I'm like, yep, this has to be here in the 5 for sure. One that also has to be here on the Critical 5 is what wraps up the 5. This is The Last Desperate Struggle. With this driving beat that keeps you going, again, reminds you of the time, with a title like The Last Desperate Struggle, not a surprise that it plays in the final puzzle of the game, where I feel like this is one where maybe players didn't get to appreciate the music as much because the stakes were so high, the puzzle was so intense that maybe players didn't get to appreciate the music all that much. But yeah, it's such a good song, and I appreciate how it's not so dire and morbid. Like, there's some hope to it, but it also has the dun 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 dun. Like the intensity and the stakes are there for sure.
It's basically Fate updated, sort of cranked up a couple notches, essentially. Has the same sort of feel with the tension and all that. But yeah, I get what you're saying with like a little bit of hope in there. I don't remember this song at all.
Yeah, exactly. Because like, I think, yeah, you're just too worried about like saving the person from murder.
Yeah, it's like my memory of this song was completely gone. It's very, very good. But yeah, I don't remember it at all.
But what do you remember on the soundtrack? Because we each have 2 tracks on the cutting room floor. Joe, hit me with yours. What stood out to you?
Well, for my first song on the cutting room floor, it's Awakening. This is essentially the game's equivalent to the investigation opening / core from an Ace Attorney game. It's very similar to the it's that.
Yeah.
And I think it's better than that song, honestly. It's really, really, really good. I love the investigation core music in all of the Ace Attorney games, and this one I think is probably, if it is allowed to be grouped in there, probably one of my favorites.
I think it should be. It's Masakazu Sugimori through and through. And you're right, it definitely channels those vibes. I definitely love the interplay of, and I'm sure you do too, between the low foundations of the piece that they introduce, and then again, it's those high pitched counter melodies that just interplay off each other so well, and it just really gets you in that groove of investigation.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. For my second track on the cutting room floor, it is, I can't believe this is the real name of the track, A White, Lovely, Lanky Man. While I wish this was the theme of Lanky Kong making an appearance in Ghost Trick Fan of Detective, unfortunately it is not. It is the theme of Inspector Cabanela, who is a cop, and is the character I mentioned earlier as having the most immaculate sprite animation for a moving person I've ever seen. He looks rotoscoped when he is dancing.
It's incredible, honestly. And you hear near the end of the clip, that's the main vibe of the piece, but, the clip we like to try, if we can, especially in 20 seconds for the cutting room floor, to highlight kind of the range of where the piece goes. But this salsa, that's really the vibe of his track. And when, he's doing all these spins and little kicks and almost Michael Jackson in his white suit, Cabanela is something else. He's a great character, but the shining example of the game's animation.
And this theme has just this amazing amount of funk to it. It's got a good groove, which fits a character who is basically dancing 100% of the time that he is on screen. The man dances when he walks upstairs, so having his theme have this nice groove to it, very fitting.
It's like funky salsa. It's really interesting, and I think a great choice. I hurt for me to leave that one off, so I'm glad you picked it up. For my tracks on the cutting room floor, I will highlight the theme of the character that's kind of opposite Cabanela. This is A Captive of Fate. This is Jowd's theme. Jowd, a detective who is imprisoned because of a misunderstanding that could Sissel correct this misunderstanding, this accident that happened in his family? We'll have to see. But Jowd is this big stoic character, and it's just such a good theme. I really wanted to put it on the Critical 5, but I feel like for character themes in particular, they fit well here on the cutting room floor. My favorite character theme in the game for sure, though.
Yeah, this is a really good theme. It also has a little bit more feel towards investigation songs as well, which maybe that's supposed to be a send up to he used to be a cop. So I don't know. I had forgotten that this character existed until I saw a picture of him and was like, oh, right. Big painting man.
That guy. Yes, absolutely. You thought we'd forget, though. Of course we wouldn't forget. Also on the cutting room floor is a courageous little animal.
greatest hero we've ever known in video games.
We couldn't not talk about Missile. And this is Missile's theme. And you're sitting there like, okay, Missile, who's Missile? Missile is the name of the Pomeranian dog. If you played Ace Attorney, you know Missile as the dog in Ace Attorney that goes and finds the metal detector and all that. Because Missile's a good boy, of course. So in Ghost Trick, Missile is the best boy, one of the greatest video game dogs ever. When you see him on lists of video game dogs, know that is well deserved. And yeah, everyone who has beaten Ghost Trick knows and loves Missile. His theme may not be the greatest. It's just like quintessential, happy, cheery Masakazu Sugimori vibes. Like, it doesn't stand out all that much, but it paints a good spectrum of what that sounds like in this DS sound font, and it's Missile. It had to be here, at least on the cutting room floor.
Missile's the most important character in all of video games. I will not be taking questions.
There you go. So it has been said, so it shall be.
Missile is like the one thing I could never forget about this game. Missile's the best. Missile's the best.
So what will I never forget about this game besides Missile? I think it's the ending. Those late game reveals are so cool. And if you get the chance to play this game, please do. More people need to play Ghost Trick because it really is in there in that contention with best games that nobody's played. And it feels almost like a kinship when you find someone who's played Ghost Trick and you get to gush about things like Missile, the best boy.
Yeah, it is regularly considered one of the best hidden treasures on the DS, and for good reason. It is a fantastic game. I should replay it one of these days. I still don't remember how I played it. Do I own it on DS? I don't know. But it's very good, and I would recommend anybody give it a shot. I wonder if it's on Android. I doubt it. That's unfortunate, probably. But yeah, I think it's the story for the most part, and like sort of the very unique idea of what if we made a game that's just Rube Goldberg machines. Just that's the gameplay mechanic. It works super well. The puzzles are a lot of fun, even though I'm pretty sure I had to like look up a couple. Wow.
Oh yeah, no shame in that for sure.
It's not an easy game to wrap your head around if you are like me and lack the ability to think ahead multiple steps. I don't know. It's good. You should play Ghost Trick, I agree.
And as you've heard, a great soundtrack. So before we talk about our next game, we like to highlight a fan cover, fan remake, whether it's on YouTube, OC Remix, some sort of cover. Let's talk about the consoles. We've talked about the consoles before. They do this kind of smooth jazz with video game music, and it doesn't get smoother than their cover of Missile's theme. So they call it Missile, consoles being CONSOULS, like soul jazz, on YouTube. Please enjoy this tasty, tasty jam, and we'll be right back.
So let's completely change modes, I guess, and talk about Bit.Trip Runner, which actually was another game that was suggested by listeners over on the Twitter as Soundchat OST. Specifically, they just asked for a Bit.Trip game, and this is the one I know the most about, so I went with this one. Bit.Trip Runner was originally released for, and here's a term you've probably not heard in a very long time, WiiWare.
Oh!
On May 14th, 2002 in PAL regions, May 17th in North America, and September 14th in Japan. This was a WiiWare game, first and foremost. Remember WiiWare?
Right up there with DSiWare.
Yeah. I straight up, before doing this research, actually legit might have forgotten that WiiWare existed. Because now it's just the eShop.
Right.
They were late to that party.
Fair.
It would then go on to release on Windows on February 28th, 2011. Also in 2011, it would show up on the 3DS on September 13th in North America, March 16th, 2012 in Europe, and July 10th, 2013 in Japan. So Japan had to wait a little while to get that on 3DS. Most recently, though, it was released on Switch on Christmas of last year, December 25th, 2020.
Huh.
The Bit.Trip series is a collection of different rhythm-based games in various genres that started with 3 games that all released in 2009, being Bit.Trip Beat, Bit.Trip Core, and Bit.Trip Void. I have only played Beat of those 3. It's like a Pong-like game. Runner is the 4th game in the series. It was developed by Gaijin Games, which actually has since changed its name to Choice Provisions. I think they changed it in like 2014, 2015. Probably a good idea. Gaijin is not exactly a term of endearment in Japanese.
Yeah.
For those who do not know, Gaijin is basically a word that means outsider. If they call you a Gaijin, they're not being nice. In terms of genre, for Bit.Trip Runner, the closest I think I could compare it to is an endless runner, but it is not an endless runner because the levels have ends. They only go for about a minute, but everything else fits that descriptor. You play as Commander Video. He is a simple 8-bit rectangle with arms and legs that are just pixels and a white visor over his face, and in each level he runs automatically to the right on a 2D platformer style stage. He can collect gold bars along the way to increase his score, as well as power-ups, little plus signs, that not only increase the score multiplier, but the higher the multiplier goes, the more complex the music becomes, because it is all attached and integrated with the song that is playing. There are also obstacles in the commander's way, such as gaps that need to be jumped over, enemies that need to be slid under, or barriers that need to be kicked to destroy, and again, it's all set to work with a musical track. You'll need to get a feel for the game's rhythm if you want to make it through the levels. If you are hit by even one obstacle, you are sent back to the beginning of the stage to try again. And that's it, really. There's no other thing I could possibly describe about Bit.Trip Runner. You now know everything there is to know about how the game plays. So here's where I'll ask you, Peter, what are your experiences with Bit.Trip Runner?
It's one of those games, and Commander Video being one of those characters where it's like the foundations of the indie game movement. So like he's an important character that makes appearances in other indie games, and yet I've never played Bit.Trip Runner. I think I do have the game on Steam among all my Steam games, to be honest, but yeah, not a game I've played. I mean, the rhythm-based part of the runner, that does appeal to me. I could give that a shot, I think.
It's a very fun game that I will never beat because it is also unforgivingly difficult. It is crazy hard in some kind of unfair ways eventually. And that's something that a lot of critics back in the day did point out, like, this game's really good. I can barely get anywhere in it. It's kind of like Thumper in that way, honestly, where that's a rhythm game that I really, really like, and I will never beat it. Ever. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's the only other Bit.Trip game I've played. I've played Beat, and I've played Runner. I haven't played any of the sequels to Runner. I haven't played any of the games that came out right after Runner. But it's a very storied franchise in indie games. For reasons that we'll go ahead and get right into it. First of all, apparently I wasn't able to find a lot of info on the creation of Runner itself, or even kind of in terms of the Bit.Trip series in general. And I think probably the main reason for that is because Bit.Trip started as like this sort of experimental little phase. Like 2009, 3 Bit.Trip games came out. In 2010, 3 Bit.Trip games came out. And they're short games, they're simple games, and they're very experimental in terms of this genre. How well would it mix with a rhythm game? How could we turn a shmup into a rhythm game, for instance? So one of their goals with Runner specifically was apparently to flesh out the series universe by, quote, showing players what exactly the world looked like. An optimistic and colorful place, while at the same time dreary and hostile. I'd say that about is right, considering it's a world where Commander Video regularly has like a rainbow trail behind him, but if you hit literally anything, you go back to the start. So yeah, that's hostile. You got that right. So while Commander Video was by all intents and purposes the main character of the Bit.Trip series, he was actually introduced as an ARG to promote the first 3 Bit.Trip games, but this is the first game in which he is actually on screen and controllable. It also broke from the general layout of the previous 3 Bit.Trip titles, because while those had 3 long levels each, this has several small levels instead. Like I said, a successful run of a Bit.Trip Runner level is probably going to run you about a minute, maybe that, maybe less. They're very short. You'll be spending longer than that on just about all of them, because again, it's very hard, but that's essentially where they went with that. And apparently, they wanted to include more abilities for the commander to do than his slide, his kick, and his jump, with some of those abilities being references to Bit.Trip Core and Bit.Trip Void, but when they gave the game to playtesters with these other abilities, players got very quickly overwhelmed because there was just too much to keep track of, and it just didn't work very well. So they shaved the game down in scale to Commander Video having those 3 basic abilities. Visuals were made to fit with Commander Video as a character, but also put an emphasis on eyeballs. I don't know what that means. I guess maybe I just blocked out the memory of the eyeballs in Bit.Trip Runner. I don't know. I mean, hey, the games ain't called Trip for nothing, I guess. So, Runner was reviewed very favorably upon release. It currently sits at a 76 on Metacritic. Most of the praise was for the simple gameplay and the fantastic soundtrack, and also the game just has a really memorable aesthetic, but a lot of criticism was, like I said, given to the fact that this game gets really hard really fast. Like, I'm talking, I've never made it past level 4, if I had to take a guess. It gets crazy difficult, like immediately. There would be 2 more Bit.Trip games to come out right after Runner in 2010, being Bit.Trip Fate, which is a shoot 'em up, and Bit.Trip Flux, which is a more fleshed out version of Bit.Trip Beat. In 2013, Runner actually got a direct sequel in the form of Bit.Trip Presents Runner 2 Future Legend of the Rhythm Alien. And then in 2018, which I completely forgot about this, it got another sequel, simply titled Runner 3.
That's right.
Runner 3 does not appear to have gotten the critical reception as good as the other 2. I don't know what's up with that, but that seems to be the case.
Wow, I guess, I knew that they were kind of related, but yeah, I mean, when you think of that title for Runner 2 with a Future Legend of the Rhythm Alien, that's one you don't forget anytime soon. And yeah, Runner 3, that makes sense that it's tied to Bit.Trip, sure.
Mm-hmm. But most importantly, in a lot of ways, Commander Video was sort of the face of indie games for a little while. He was essentially in the spot that Shovel Knight is now in. Shovel Knight has completely taken his place. Shovel Knight is the indie character now. He's the one that's in everything. But Commander Video used to be that. He has shown up in all sorts of stuff. He's a playable character in Super Meat Boy, Bitejacker, Retro City Rampage, UFHO 2, Team Indie, Runbow, Mutant Mud's Super Challenge, Indie Pogo, Joggernauts, and he is a member of the roster for the upcoming indie Smash Brothers platform fighter game called Fraymakers. Meanwhile, he was also featured as an official skin in the Xbox 360 version of Minecraft. You can see a figurine of him in Game Dev Tycoon, and most surprisingly and most awesome of all, he appears as a trophy in Super Smash Bros. For Wii U, which makes him the first indie game character to appear in Smash in any way.
Oh, I did not know that.
I had forgotten about that before looking it up. I remember it being kind of a big deal when people realized, like, it was that and Rayman were the two, like, what? Wait, what? What? Why are they trophies? Whoa. Very interesting. Basically, Commander Video walked so Shovel Knight could run, essentially. Shovel Knight has gone far farther in being Mr. Indie Games than Commander Video ever got, but the fact that when they make a game like Fraymakers, that Commander Video is one of the first characters revealed and, like, a member of the starting roster, that should show you that he's a real big deal. He used to be a pretty well-known name in the indie scene. So, the weirdest part about this one was I had to dig to find the scraps of information that I found on the composer for Bit.Trip Runner. His name is Matt Harwood. So, usually, a good resource to start when you are looking into who did the music for a game is you go to Wikipedia, and it usually lists a composer under the credits. Not any of the Bit.Trip games. None of them. So then I went digging. Who did the music for Bit.Trip Runner? I came up with the name Matt Harwood after really, really having to dig. I'm serious. He also was credited in most of the Bit.Trip games as Petrified Productions, but even searching that, found nothing. I found a small indie studio that seems to be defunct, and I don't think that was him, and that's the only thing I could find. Then, I finally came across a Destructoid article that was supposed to be linking to a video interview with him, but the video wasn't present in the article.
No.
Like, the embed was just gone. So I went to YouTube and I went to look for it, and I did find it, and there really wasn't anything there. In fact, the guy from Destructoid, during the interview, he says, like, now that you're finally getting out there, people might know your name. They'll know that. And, no.
Oops.
This appears to be the only coverage he ever got. Ever. In fact, I was worried because one of the first things that came around when you searched Matt Harwood was an obituary. It was not his, but that is always one of the weirdest, most sort of kind of panicky things that you find when you do research on something like this. And it's really weird that I had to really dig to find anything about this guy because he's worked on a couple of pretty well-known games. For one of his lesser-known games is Frontline's Fuel of War. That game I've never heard of, but I have heard of Alien Hominid, and he apparently did music for that. He has done music for every Bit.Trip game, including Runner 2 and Runner 3. He did the music for the game Homefront.
Oh my gosh, that's a name. Wow.
He worked on Infinite Crisis, which is a DC game, and also a game called Streamline. And he's a ghost, apparently. There's nothing. Unfortunate, but that's just sort of how it goes sometimes. According to the Wikipedia article, the main goal of the game's soundtrack was to combine 8-bit chiptune music with other genres, namely techno and electronica. Harwood says he was actually sent an Atari by one of the developers in order to allow him to sample the exact quote-unquote sound fonts the system used, because they wanted the music to sound like what you'd hear coming out of an Atari. And I guess they just sent him an Atari. And I think during that interview, he was like, I never gave it back. I think he said he still has it, at least in 2011. Harwood was actually brought to Gaijin's attention through his work on Alien Hominid, which is another one of those, like, if you've never heard of Alien Hominid, it was another one of the first games to sort of come out of the Newgrounds scene and enter the indie games scene. It's by the Behemoth, which does, like, Castle Crashers and Battle Block Theater and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's right.
So the goal, according to Harwood, was to make it so that the player felt both as if they were helping create the music, which when you jump or do any, like, actions or anything, a little tone plays that sort of mixes in with the music, but he also wanted it to feel like the music was, quote, happening to the player, which I think he does a very good job on that. Also, this game has 2 songs from our old friends Anamanaguchi, who we talked about back in episode 97 for their work on Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Those 2 songs are both from the album Dawn Metropolis, and they serve as the game's main menu and credits themes. So let's jump into what in the world does this runner where you have to go to the rhythm of the music sound like? Well, I'm glad you asked. We're going to start our 5 critical tracks with critical track number 1, Blackout City. So this is one of the aforementioned songs by Anamanaguchi. This plays on the main menu. If you've never heard the Dawn Metropolis album, I would 100% recommend it, because it all sounds like this, and it's all super good. This might be one of the best songs on the album, and it is really good for an introduction track.
Yeah, honestly, hearing this song, I think if you know anything about video game music or chiptune music, like, this is undeniably Anamanaguchi. Like, there is nobody else that this could be. I could have heard this and thought it was from the Scott Pilgrim soundtrack, honestly.
Yeah, I 100% could see that. Anamanaguchi does good work, man. They are one of the best artists in their chosen genre. They're fantastic. But let's get into some of the stuff that Matt Harwood made, including critical track number 2, which is the only song I've ever heard in-game, Impetus. This is the song that plays in the first set of levels. I've never heard past this in-game. Ever. All of the tracks sort of have these one-word titles that, they're sort of like, you're getting started, you're working through it, you're making your move, etc., etc. You're not going to give up, etc., etc., even though I totally gave up on this game. And it's, I think, if you've heard any song from Bit.Trip Runner, it's probably this one. Either because you also did not make it past the Impetus section of levels, or because this is just like one of the most recognizable songs on the soundtrack. It's so good. That melody is disgustingly catchy and fun, and that little like rhythm in the background, the da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da, fantastic. And it's especially cool in-game as it builds up the different parts and adds the different instruments as you keep going.
That's so cool. Like, I did not know, like, while listening to this soundtrack, that there was such an interactive involvement with the gameplay and the music. Because, it's so simplistic and catchy, but the player adding their own elements to it, I'm sure, enhances the experience. And, you can definitely hear in these clips where you go from like one sound to like you hear what the next big jump is. You hear like when the drums kick in more and maybe a little bit more bass in there. You can kind of hear it flesh out a little bit. I think that was a good element to do with these clips here to show what the different levels and variations of the track sound like.
Yeah, it's extremely cool to hear in game. I do recommend people go give 5 minutes of your time to Bit.Trip Runner, hear some of the music and how it works in the game, and then probably promptly uninstall it, because I don't know a single human being that's ever finished Bit.Trip Runner. But anyways, critical track number 3 is Tenacity. This one sort of has kind of a different tone than Impetus. It's still like very positive and driving and feels like the concept of moving forward put into a song. And I've never heard this song in game, but it really stood out to me when I was listening to the soundtrack while getting ready for this show, because I don't know, something about this sort of lower octave groove that it has just really, really stuck with me. It's a very interesting piece.
Yeah, it definitely adds the lower register on the synths there, and the drum bass kick, to have that be what's going, instead of like a higher synth snare hit, to have the bass be the one that's the driving motivation and the driving beat. That's really neat. I like that one for sure.
Yeah. Critical track number 4, though, is Triumph. I really like this song specifically because the real piano,
yes,
added in the background, just has this amazing effect, and listening to this song makes you feel like you can do anything. It's so good. Real pianos need to be put to chiptunes more often. It's super cool to hear.
And I think, the like it's a kind of a melody that continues throughout, like you're hearing it a lot here, but I think it's the differences between the tracks that really highlight, what makes each so good. And thinking it over the course of the arduous journey and how that progress. I mean, when you start with just like the simple and then you're ending with these big piano chords, I mean, by comparison, of course, but like long extended piano chords that really show a sense of, triumph.
Yeah, and I described the last track as like the feeling of moving forward distilled into a song, but honestly, I think that could describe every song on this soundtrack almost. They're all just sort of that driving melody that's like, yeah, keep going, push forward. They're encouraging. That would be a word to describe this soundtrack. It's very encouraging. Not that that helped me, but it's very encouraging. For our final critical track, number 5 is Fortitude. So instead of having the low piano chords, this one replaces it with like a very deep synth. But it has very close to like the same sort of feeling of triumph. But when the melody of the song kicks in, it kind of feels almost emotional. Like, it kind of gets me. And I've never gotten to this point in the game. And that's a good sign.
I get the sense that, especially when the melody comes in, it's almost like partial. It's not the full beepity boopity boopity all around, but it's like it hits the essential notes to be reminiscent of that melody. But I get the sense of this one that like you've ascended.
Yeah.
Like you've hit that otherworldly level, and it's like, oh yes, that melody that played me so much, that's only just an afterthought at this point based on where I am.
Yeah, that's an interesting interpretation, actually. I like that a lot. It's definitely fitting for a song that is basically describing itself as the term fortitude. Very interesting way to look at that. So, for tracks on the cutting room floor, I have two. The first one is Conviction. This song is really, really cool. I think it plays at some like post-ending game levels, I think. I don't know. This song, I think, is on the soundtrack before the credits piece. But it also, from what I could tell, I think Fortitude is actually the last level? So I don't know. But Conviction is very good. This is a very good song that just sort of, it feels very close to Tenacity almost, but just a little bit different.
It sounds a little busier, like it's trying to do more things, a little bit more of a hodgepodge, but I wonder, it sounds like a lot of these tracks are still even in the same key, and that makes me wonder if that's actually consistent throughout the whole game. That's something to think about.
Maybe. I don't know, I didn't think about that. Also, my ability to identify key is long gone. I'm sorry, Mr. Mulvaney. But my other track on the cutting room floor, I wanted to bring the other Anamanaguchi song on the soundtrack. That is Mermaid. This song is an absolute trip. I love this song. It is like 10 minutes long. It is a long... I'm pretty sure it's the longest song that Anamanaguchi's ever released. But it's this really heavy song, and it's used as the game's credits theme, like I said, which I think is very fitting. I doubt the whole song plays over the credits, because again, it's like 10 minutes long.
It also doesn't sound like your usual Anamanaguchi song. I think it's really cool to hear the difference here, but especially when it's just a lot heavier and maybe a little more grungy, more guitars than actual chiptune.
Yeah.
But it sounds great.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with Anamanaguchi. Like, get them on more games. Why haven't we done that? I can't believe, like, Scott Pilgrim is the only game they've ever scored that somebody else made. I believe, if I remember correctly, you said during your research, you found that they had like made their own game and scored that.
Yeah, that's right.
But like, how is Scott Pilgrim the only game they've been brought in to do music for? Like, come on, get on Anamanaguchi and a recording studio. What will I never forget about Bit.Trip Runner? I'm never going to beat this game. I should try Runner 2. I don't know if that one's as unforgivingly hard as Runner 1 is. I think I own Runner 2. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I might. It's a fine game. It's good. Commander Video, I think, is the more interesting place to look when it comes to some of the Bit.Trip games, because he sort of represents an era when indie games weren't as prominent as they are today. It's kind of hard to think about the fact that, like, the indie boom is a relatively recent thing in the industry. And games like Super Meat Boy and the Bit.Trip series and Braid, those are the games that sort of kickstarted this whole movement, essentially. And Commander Video was sort of the face of that for a little while. And it's just really neat to look back at that as like this evidence of an era that is long gone, which is a little weird to think about, but honestly, it's a really cool angle to go in on these games with.
I'm glad you brought this game up because, yeah, it's certainly a game that, yeah, I've heard of, and I've seen that Commander Video character before, but knew nothing about the soundtrack or the game. Didn't even know it came out in 2010, just like the original launch of Ghost Trick in Japan. But yeah, great soundtracks to cover this week, so thank you so much for listening. That will do it for us this week on Original Soundchat. You can find me on Twitter at PeteSpeakeasy. Joe is over at the Dobaga. The video version of the show is on the Rhymes with Asia YouTube channel, but it's really that MP3 podcast version that you want, hosted by Anonymous Dinosaur at anondino.squarespace.com. That's also where Joe's other podcast, Smash Your Pieces, is hosted, and you can find Smash Your Pieces and Original Soundchat on podcast services all around the globe, wherever you get your podcasts, including on Spotify, where we have the Spotify feed with episodes and bonus tracks, but we also have a Spotify playlist, where if we've talked about a video game track on the show and it's on Spotify, it's going on that monster playlist. Joe, anything added this week?
So Bit.Trip Runner is in fact on Spotify, so that's really cool. That'll end up on there. Despite the fact that Capcom has been honestly really good about dumping their soundtracks on Spotify, Ghost Trick is not among them. And that's a bummer.
It just goes to show how forgotten Ghost Trick really is. Wow. When you're done listening, you can find us on social media at Soundchat OST. You can leave some feedback for us. How are we doing with these episodes? And let us know some suggestions for games that you'd like us to cover in the future, because that's one of our big pushes for 2021.
Yeah, it should be noted, both of these games were listener suggestions, so
that's only going to continue in the coming weeks, honestly. And as far as a merch store, we used to be on a former platform, but we're looking at Redbubble. We'll get back to you on confirming when that's all locked down, though. So keep in touch there. And we're also going to work on some bonus tracks for you to flesh out some of that podcast feed a little bit more. Joe, who are we talking about next week?
I will be talking about Shogo Sakai.
You can wonder what that game is for sure. I will be talking about Ryoji Yoshitomi. All right, Joe, let's play us out.
Surprisingly hard to find any remix or cover of any song from Bit.Trip Runner. The closest I found was more a mashup than a remix, but somebody, a group, I assume, under the YouTube channel The Three Derpers, that's all one word.
Number 3.
Number 3. Yeah, it's the number 3, THE 3 DERPERS. But they did a mashup of Impetus, Tenacity, and Triumph all into one song, and honestly, it sounds pretty good. So enjoy that, I suppose.
All right, it definitely sounds good for sure. Thank you so much for listening this week on Original Soundchat. We'll see you next time. Take care.